Enigma depravatio est. Enigma crudelitas est.
Welcome back, my fellow seekers. Atlantia. Atlantia is another name for Atlantis, according to the Roman scholar Pliny of the 1st century AD. The location of this symbol can give us another clue to the origins of Atlantis. And can you guess where this carving of the swastika was taken? Well, let's first hear an account from Pliny, presented by Voices of the Past, and then we'll dig deeper into my hypothesis on Atlantia.
The whole of this country has successively had the names of Etheria, Atlantia, and last of all Ethiopia, from Aethiops, the son of Vulcan. It is not at all surprising that towards the extremity of this region, the men and animals assume a monstrous form. All the country, after we pass Meroe, is bounded by the Troglodytae and the Red Sea, it being 3 days' journey from Napata to the shores of that sea. Throughout the whole of this district, the rainwater is carefully preserved at several places, while the country that lies between is extremely productive of gold. The parts beyond this are inhabited by the Adabuli, a nation of Ethiopia, and here, over against Meroe, are the Megabari, by some writers called the Adiabari. They occupy the city of Apollo. Some of them, however, are nomads, living on the flesh of elephants. Opposite to them, on the African side, dwell the Macrobi, and then again, beyond the Megabari, there are the Memnones and the Debeli, and at a distance of 20 days' journey, the Cretensi. Beyond these are the Dochi, and then the Gymnetes, who always go naked, and after them the Andete, the Mothete, and the Ipsidore, who are of a black tint, but stain the body all over with a kind of red earth. On the African side again there are the Medemni, and then a nation of nomads who live on the milk of the Canecephalus, and then the Aladi and the Cerbatae, which last are said to be 8 cubits in height.
When we think of the name Atlantis, we tend to associate it with the Atlantic Ocean, but we forget that the name was born out of Africa with a Greek and Roman pronunciation of regions in North Africa as well as down to Ethiopia, for which some dynasties associate it as Atlantia, a prefix that comes from a god like Atlas, god of war. Many Greek and Roman gods were simply inspired by the Egyptian gods. This is why we see Herodotus' map shows place names like Atarantis, Atlas, Atlantes, Atlantis, and Atlantic. These place names move as new lands are discovered on the western parts of Africa. But the original names derived from the Nile down into Ethiopia, the farthest extent of the Egyptian world order, and the birthplace of Egyptian culture, and the birthplace of fully modern Homo sapiens, going back some 70,000 years with a mysterious mutation that gave birth to syntax.
From Asmara, I'm travelling to the southwest of Eritrea to see more evidence of early civilizations in the country. High up in the mountains is a place rarely visited by outsiders, the site of Kaheto, which is near where the Sphinx in the museum was found. Rock art nearby shows that this area has been inhabited for some 7,000 years. The sheer number of archaeological remains spread over a wide area at Kaheto suggests that there was once an important site in this region in ancient times. Very little is known about the society that was based here, but it's believed that there was once an independent settlement that thrived in this part of Eritrea for hundreds of years. This is known as the Temple of Mariam Wa'iro, and so far it's the most important site to be excavated here at Gehato. You can see the 4 columns, a mass of fallen stones and pillars, and the remains of a wall. It's believed to have been a place of worship. So Suleiman's telling me that across Gehato there are like 27 sites where they're excavating, and really it does cover a big area of land. So clearly at some stage there must have been a society that really flourished here in this part of Eritrea, and it seems to me that it's a story that's being uncovered.
When I look at this archaeological site, it looks like it's been devastated by time. War, natural disasters, changes in dynasties, all that stone scattered around looks like it's been pillaged and broken down from this temple complex, such as being repurposed for livestock stone walls, or simply for hut houses made out of foundation stone walls. Sometimes people are far more effective at erasing history than natural disasters. The Egyptians more than likely used this site as a circular trading route down from the Red Sea to the heart of the Ethiopian trails that led back to the Nile Highway up to the Garden of Eden, that being the Delta. So this site could be 7,000 years old, one of the first settlements of the Black Egyptian dynasties. Egypt at its garden is the juncture of 3 continents, where the Celtic regions of Europe meet the Mesopotamians and the Ethiopians who follow the Nile upstream, and where they converge, giving Egypt a multicultural inheritance. But the strong aesthetic design was mainly associated to the entrance of the Garden Delta. But that doesn't mean that Egyptian cultures did not diverge their designs to fit to new locations. It was only at the capital where the architectural designs were very refined. At times, Egypt was ruled by more Berber-like Europeans, other times more Mesopotamian, but the original Egyptians were more than likely settled by Black Ethiopians who followed the river downstream to the Garden Delta, where they established Atlantia's lost city-state, possibly going back over 12,000 years ago. The specific ethnic group that has the most genetic connection with Egypt is the Habesha people of Eritrea, with its Semitic roots in the land of Cush, which is mentioned in Genesis as the place that leads to the Garden of Eden. This group of people have a genetic connection with the ancient Jews and Arabs over 2000 BC, which may have had more of a darker tone at the time, so they would not have looked quite the same as they do today due to the intermixing and globalization. The Habesha's African script, the Fido, has its roots in Egyptian hieroglyphs, like many other Semitic groups, as YouTuber Mason points out. So the early Egyptian dynasties would have looked a little more like the Habesha people, not totally black or white or tan, but more of a brown tone fitting to the geography at the time. But this changes over thousands of years as new cultures are inherited and are mixing together. Atlantia is everything where the Nile snakes up towards the Mediterranean and where it connects its trading routes along the Red Sea and down the Nile towards Ethiopian region at the tail of the snake. But the head of the snake is towards the north, where the lost city-state of the true Atlantean city-state must be at, which is under Cairo. And who knows, possibly some of the stones or even artifacts at this site may have been remnants that were taken from the lost city-state of Atlantia. Now, of all the news on Black Lives Matter movement with its pros and cons, or communists, I do think we need to give a little credit to specifically Ethiopian Africans in their contribution to the origins of Egypt, because their lives do matter in this mysterious history that kind of was whitewashed. Now, I have stumbled upon articles promoted by black nationalists trying to paint them as the sole owners of Egypt and Atlantis and Eden, trying to paint this African black ethno kind of continent. Shocker, not everyone on this massive continent are black, as YouTuber Mason has pointed out. Reality is Egypt has been inherited by many cultures. It's just so old, and it has such a geopolitically valued region, even if we just go by the 4,000 years of history. So Egypt is a very geopolitically valued part of the Holy Land. But I do agree with the black nationalists in this article that, African tribes did play a major role in shaping Egypt's identity, and that it can be very problematic for YouTubers like Atlantean Garden. I think the origins of Eden and Atlantis does favor the black origins hypothesis over the white origins due to geographic determinisms like the Nile flowing from south to north, and it's the only safe route out of Africa. It is the logical route that most hunter and gatherer tribes would have used to leave Africa. The second best route would have been the Gulf of Aden, which, yes, also has a connection with the word origin of Eden, which is associated with the desert regions of Africa, hence the Garden of Eden, the garden within the desert. The garden being the Nile and its delta, the agricultural plain. So I don't know what took so long for people like Christopher Columbus and Plato and Roman historians to kind of figure this stuff out, because once you have the eye of God, Google Earth, and it's just kind of like clear as day. You can see that garden sticking out of the desert pretty clearly. It's like, oh shit, the Garden of Eden's a real freaking place. Wow, the Bible actually is right on something. When you start to piece together the logic, it just fits. I mean, as my perspective as a landscape architect and as a Catholic, it's just like, yeah, that's the Garden of Eden. Holy shit, it's a real place. It makes sense anthropologically and theologically and linguistically and geographically. It just fits. So this is where I do favor the black origins hypothesis on the origins of Egypt. And I even do think that the Sphinx, the last remnant carving of it, at least, looks like an African woman, to be honest. And John Anthony West has kind of pointed something out like this.
Now, the face of the Sphinx, this is a really controversial thing, right? Because the face of the Sphinx is clearly newer than the body. It's less eroded, and it's also a very African-looking face. Do they think that, which obviously it's the continent Africa, but do they think the Nubians had conquered Egypt at one point in time, right? And wasn't the speculation that one of the Nubian pharaohs had created this?
Yeah, well, some said that. 19th century travelers, lots of them noted that this was really an African face, but what they meant is that it's a sub-Sahara African face. It's a real African face. The Nubians are very black, but have more or less finer features. They don't have the jaw like that. I mean, that looks more like an NBA basketball player than an Egyptian. Right. Anyway, the headdress is all redone. The picture before, were covered with sand. Right. You see how weathered the headdress was.
They redid the bottom of it.
They redid the headdress in its entirety. The face itself is a much harder outcrop of limestone, so it hasn't weathered to the same extent that the body of the Sphinx has weathered.
So you think it's of the same era?
We don't know, actually. Because you see, the African face is a real problem, actually. Of course, the Egyptians are as prejudiced as everyone else, and they don't want to actually believe that the Sphinx itself could be a sub-Saharan African, maybe from an earlier period when the Africans were pharaohs. We don't know.
Wasn't there some speculation that initially it was an actual lion's face, and that the lion's face was cut down to create this pharaoh's face?
That's us speculating that way, because the head is way too small for the body. And it certainly, and we had the NYPD, we did this big study. I think that's the next slide coming up. Yeah, there it is. There you see with Frank Domingo, who was the NYPD.
Sketch artist?
Well, he was a senior forensic artist for the NYPD. It's a guy who knows about physiognomy. So he did a study of the comparative faces of the Sphinx and of the Sphinx. That's the one on the right. And Pharaoh Khafra, his conclusion was that no competent artist or sculptor could possibly have used the same model for the face of the Sphinx as for the Khafra face. Khafra face, and there's a few Khafra faces floating around. So my criminal partner, when Frank gave us that study, his comparative study, Boris Said said, for for the academic establishment, this is bad news and worse news. The bad news is that there was an Atlantis, and the worst news is they were black. Which my black friends like that phrase.
Keep in mind, Egypt or Atlantia is mostly everything that touches the Nile. Then yes, Ethiopian African dynasties could have easily made their way up with boats to inherit the capital of Atlantia. More than likely they were the first hunter and gatherers to establish a dynasty in the oasis that is in the shape of a snake or lotus. Those who inherited this garden made by God could either reign as a snake or reign as beautifully as a lotus, the yin and yang balance of power. Hence the swastika, which is located in the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela in Ethiopia. If you haven't seen my video on the Aryans of Iran, please do so. Now, many believe Ethiopian history starts with the kingdom of Aksum, which many believe that the rock-cut churches and the megalithic stela were made at that time, but I do question this because
to understand the rise of the ancient kingdom of Aksum, we first have to delve further back into history to find out more about the people who laid the foundations for Aksum's greatness. We begin with the ancient land of Punt, which is in a region now known as the Horn of Africa. It was the ancient Egyptians who named it Punt Land, which means the land of the gods. There's evidence the Egyptians traded with the people here some 3,500 years ago, arriving in their distinctive ships. There are records of voyages to Punt depicted in the temple of Queen Hatshepsut at Dar al-Bahri in Egypt. Punt was an important source of the gold that the Egyptians used to decorate their tombs. Jewelry, perfumes, and oils also formed much of this trade.
So Aksum is the product of Egypt's empire, going back to at least 2000 BC. The megalithic stelas found in Aksum is testament to the megalithic architectural knowledge that was inherited from Egypt, and these trades were kept alive from master to apprentice, all the way up to the Aksum kingdom, which is the southern tributary kingdom of the larger Egyptian empire. Aksum guards the tail end of the snake of Egypt. In some way, Egypt or Atlantia is a federation of kingdoms, at times living in peace during the lotus periods, as I would call it, and other times living in war during the snake periods, vying for power at the head of the snake of Egypt. Despite these kingdoms warring with each other, they all still identified as inheriting this Garden of Eden, vying to be the Lion King at the capital in Memphis. Think of it kind of like Game of Thrones, all part of the 7 kingdoms of the Garden of Eden, stretching down to Ethiopia. Now, Samir Osmanagic, the proponent of the Bosnian Pyramid, for which I'm still not convinced of, but he does bring up some good reports on Aksum's megaliths.
Now, what Smithsonian, Encyclopedia Britannica, Wikipedia, BBC, CNN, the major archaeological, scientific, and educational institutions have in common when it comes to Aksum? They all claim that the biggest obelisks on the planet, behind me, date from the 4th century AD. And they are all wrong. They claim actually that the last ruler of the pagan empire here, just before they turned to Christianity, King Ezana, actually was the one who erected the biggest stela on the planet. This one right here. It is called the Grand Stela. And before him, he claimed a couple more stelas. Obelisk of Aksum, King Ezana stela of Aksum, were also erected by the people about 1700 years back. In this park, we actually have 3 types of these megalithic stones. Some of them, indeed, we can call stela, those with carvings. Some of them have flat 4 sides, nicely dressed. And some of them are just rough megalithic blocks. And they are all erected standing upright. The biggest one behind me, originally 33 to 34 meters long, has a mass of 520 tons. According to the archaeological research, this area indeed has been inhabited for almost 3,000 years. However, Queen Makeda ruled her kingdom 1,370 years BC, or about 3,400 years ago. That was 400 years before King Solomon. Now, are the King David and King Solomon real? Did they really build the first temple? Hard to say. Evidence still needed to confirm those stories. Now, go back to those megaliths. As I said, all the official references, official sources, and when I say official, when I mention Encyclopedia Britannica, that's been around for 250 years, and almost any other scientific source in any country of the world is using Encyclopedia Britannica, well, they are saying this was built 1700 years back. Have people of Aksum Kingdom had tools to shape this material, to transport it, and to erect it? Now, many people, because of the look, call this material granite. It does look like a gray granite, pink, gray, white. However, this material is missing one important element, and that is quartz. No quartz. You don't see the beautiful shining lights coming from the quartz. Now, according to geologists, this material is called Nepheline syenite. Looks like a granite. It's hard like a granite, specific weight like a granite. But instead of quartz, what we do have here is the aluminum. So it is really metallic. When you hit it, it does have different sound than other stones. Now, this type of material can be met all around the planet, but in very small quantities. And the biggest quantities are actually here in northern and eastern Ethiopia.
I agree with Samir that these megaliths were most likely a lot older, but were carved during the Christian time. Some of the obelisks may have been moved from their original spot. Originally these had a smooth triangular point like an obelisk, but with its own unique style, not quite as geometrically formal as like what you see in Egypt, but the symbolism may have been the same. And the placement originally was meant to match the stars, as Samir points out. I'll leave a link to the rest of his tour of Aksum. By the time Christianity came to Aksum, Egyptian influence had greatly waned. Aksum became just another unique culture that was born from Egypt, just like the Minoans and the Sumerians possibly. So I think during the Aksum kingdom these steles were carved along with the stone churches. These were originally pagan sites converted to honor Christianity, and rightfully so. The swastika in the church may have also been carved as an honor to Islam, for this was an area of Islam and Christianity mixing together. To learn more about the swastika, see my video on the Aryans of Iran. Even the Ark of the Covenant, the stone stela tablets, are said to be in Ethiopia, but more than likely they're a copy from the original tablets, and maybe the original tablets are broken away and long gone. But I do think that the original tablets probably actually had more Egyptian hieroglyphic style writing on it. Probably not formal style of hieroglyphs, but something more Semitic and a blending. In some way, the Ten Commandment tablets are like the Philosopher's Stone. These tablets were inspired by Egyptian tablets, and may have been the original inspiration of the Philosopher's Stone, before all the fantasy kind of ideas about gold and all that, and magical force power, stuff like that. Because the idea was that the Ten Commandments had some kind of magical property. But more than likely, it's simply, I do believe, possibly maybe God made these stones and carved some fancy Egyptian writing in it, something that the Jews probably would have been able to read. But that's probably all the extent of the magic aspect of the stone, was simply that the letters were supernaturally engraved onto the stones. So that's what gave birth to this idea of a magical stone, and then eventually turned into liquid and gold and all the other stuff during the Enlightenment periods. So the idea that this is the Philosopher's Stone is that these are commandments or laws laid down by God, but they're not detailed laws, they're just foundations, and it's Moses, the high priest or philosopher, who has to interpret these laws and expand upon them, just like a constitution is simply a foundation and has to be amended and interpreted by a group of people. So that's what the idea of the Philosopher's Stone is like, the Ten Commandments. And that's why at city halls you see the Ten Commandment tablets or stelas made out of granite in front of your city hall. So that because it symbolizes the foundation of basic laws, and from there new laws are born. And the philosopher has to interpret it, or the politician, I guess you could say now. The philosopher has to question the commandments. It's not that God's saying, yo, these are laws set in stone and you cannot break them, because, there are issues like thou shalt not kill. Can you kill in self-defense, or can you kill as a soldier? When does that consider to be murder? These are the philosophical and political debates that God wants us to figure out on our own with our intellect that He gave us. But He simply set the basic foundation, and those foundation tablets may have originally been at the Lalibela Church. Even the Book of Enoch is said to be in Ethiopia, so Ethiopia definitely has a connection with Genesis. Originally in Latin, Ethiopia was spelled with an A, just as Atlantia. Ethiopia is a geographic area that had very different meanings depending on the period it was used in. Frank Joseph stated that until the 1st century BC, Ethiopia referred to the Atlantic coast of North Africa, and that Ethiopia simply meant the land inhabited by dark-skinned people. Pliny the Elder stated that Ethiopia was formerly called Atlantia. And Proclus, the Greek philosopher, was convinced that Atlantis existed and was connected to ancient Ethiopia, quoting the Ethiopian history of Marcellus. Colonel Alexander Bragina believed in the connection between ancient Ethiopia and Atlantis. This map dates from about 1650 and published in a book by J.A. Rogers, shows that South Atlantic as the Ethiopian Ocean, while the entire Central Africa is named Ethiopia. In 1936, D. Duvalier suggested that there had been two Atlantis, one in the Atlantic and one in Ethiopia. It might be noted that in Greek mythology, Poseidon was given two Ethiopias, one in the east and the other in the west. We can only conclude that the location of the original Ethiopia is nearly as difficult to point out as the location of Atlantis, it seems. But migration routes can easily tell us the likelihood of where the name Atlantia and Ethiopia, with an A, came from. And the Nile seems the most logical conclusion, for it was the ancient highway with trails around its waterfalls. Names are passed down by people, and this was the most populated region in Africa at the time before the Romans. The name may have been used during the Aksum kingdom, but before Aksum was a kingdom called Da'amat, going back to 1000 BC. This was the last Egyptian tributary kingdom in the region of Eritrea before the rise of Aksum. Also another kingdom was Saba across the Red Sea, which may have been another Egyptian tributary kingdom, which also formed later with Da'amat. To conclude, I want to stress I'm not supporting these ideas to promote black nationalists or white nationalists. I see articles and videos of people taking these legends and stories to justify their superiority of their culture, and this is completely meaningless in the 21st century as we evolve into a Type 1 civilization. There has never been a Type 1 civilization on this planet. So if your idea of Atlantis is that, then I suggest you look at Venus for a lost planetary civilization. I want to take these stories as a unifying history, and I believe Egypt is the unifying mother culture of Western and Eastern civilization. Ultimately, if we live with the principles of the Philosopher's Stone and what Christ the Avatar has taught us, then race starts to become meaningless. It is a factor, and we have to acknowledge that with rational policies. and that may mean demilitarizing the police and giving them more training. Slavery is a curse that started in Atlantis, and we have to transcend that curse by exposing the unknown enigmas in our world. This has been Enigma Seeker. Keep seeking those enigmas.
Jambo, jambo bwana, habari gani? Nzuri sana. Wageni, mwakaribishwa. Kenya yetu, hakuna matata. Jambo bwana, habari gani? Nzuri sana. Wageni, mwakaribishwa. Kenya yetu, hakuna matata. Ngiti jambo bwana, habari gani? Nzuri sana. Wageni, mwakaribishwa. Kenya yetu, hakuna matata. Jambo bwana, habari gani? Nzuri sana. Wageni, mwakaribishwa. Kenya yetu, hakuna matata. Ngiti jambo bwana, habari gani? Nzuri sana. Wageni, mwakaribishwa. Kenya yetu, hakuna matata. Ngiti jambo bwana, habari gani? Nzuri sana. Wageni, mwakaribishwa. Kenya yetu, hakuna matata. Ngiti jambo bwana, habari gani? Nzuri sana. Wageni, mwakaribishwa. Kenya yetu, hakuna matata. Kenya nchi nzuri, nchi ya maajabu, nchi ya kupendeza, hakuna matata. Kenya yetu, hakuna matata. Hakuna matata, hakuna matata, hakuna matata, hakuna